We're going to begin in 5 seconds. So, we're here from Alberta Climate Dialogue, or ABCD. We're a large community university research practitioner deliberative democracy project that was formed, well, or at least had its beginnings in 2007 at the Deliberative Democracy Consortium. That's since been funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada to the tune of about $1 million. And the project began formally in 2010, will end in 2015. So our work together as practitioners from 4 continents and researchers from 12 universities arose out of shared values and shared political commitments. We were all deeply concerned about climate change. We kind of came together spontaneously at the DDC out of that concern. We're all committed to deliberative democracy, and we wanted to see what it would be like to try and bring citizens together around climate issues in a really tough context. Alberta, where we're doing this work, is home to the tar sands, is the part of Canada that relies most on coal for power generation. It's a tough place to talk to people about climate change. But from 2010 to 2014, we partnered with the city of Edmonton, the capital city of Alberta, to bring 57 citizens together, a representative mini-public, to talk about energy transition for the city of Edmonton. They ended up recommending, for very diverse reasons, that the city of Edmonton take a low-carbon pathway. We're waiting to see how the city carries that forward. We partnered with the Old Man Watershed Council to look at climate and adaptation issues in a way that allowed participants to really do a lot of the framing themselves. And we partnered with the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance to hold a set of province-wide virtual deliberations around energy efficiency regulation and funding, and we're now trying to see how that influences provincial policy. So we brought a lot of research capacity to try and understand what is people's experience in these settings, what influence have these exercises had on the politics of Alberta. And I'll speak more in a few minutes about a big question that is haunting us as we draw the project to a close. And you can also grab us for coffee or come see one of our sessions tomorrow and learn more about what we're doing. But at the moment, I want to hand over to 5 of my colleagues who are each going to talk about an aspiration that we held in the project and challenges that arose around that aspiration.
Thanks, David. I'm Susanna Hazell, and the project I worked on was the virtual deliberation that David mentioned, and we were trying to impact energy efficiency policy in Alberta. We felt this was a politically viable way to influence climate change in the Alberta context that David just briefly introduced. So I partnered with, the ABCD partnered with the Alberta Energy Efficiency Alliance, which is a multi-sector organization that collects input and provides input to the Alberta government on energy efficiency issues. So that this is energy utilities, oil and gas companies, product and service providers, and nonprofits all coming together saying we need to hear from the broad provincial public about what they think around energy efficiency. And we identified 2 points of possible influence. This was regulation and funding. So given that, there was 2 things that were important. Number one, that we heard from people from around the province. It couldn't just be urban or just rural. Secondly, there needed to be enough people participating that there was a voice that was sufficient that the Alberta government would sit up and take notice. So given that, we decided to go with a virtual deliberation, not having people travel too far and creating more carbon emissions. We had 6 sessions, and we did it using a webinar and phone-based technique with volunteer facilitators and note takers. So I know and I believe that technology is a powerful way to connect people, to produce useful outcomes, and to help to transform the way people understand issues. But we were absolutely faced with clunky technology, and that technology, it obstructed, first of all, participant access. Secondly, it obstructed the quality of discussion. Additionally, we wrestled with short time frames. How long would people who didn't know each other meet on the phone or on the web? And so we decided 2 hours was kind of a limit to ask people. And that short time frame made it difficult to delve into the depth of discussion, deliberation that we wanted. And finally, there was a narrow frame. I mentioned it when I first started speaking, that we were looking at what were the points of political influence that were possible. And people came wanting to talk about climate change. And so we wrestled with that during the discussions, people's anticipated desire to address certain issues and our desire to influence policy. So that to the extent that we were able to overcome these challenges, it was through persistence. through repetition, we had 6 sessions, so we got better as we went. And finally, being transparent with our participants about the challenges we were facing and bringing them in on that process.
It's okay, I got one. Hi, everyone. It's Pat McKinnon. We aspire to have our 6-day deliberative dialogue with citizens really influence and impact many more people. We believe that connecting the citizens panel with civil society and extending their voices and their reach would increase the likelihood of impact. A very vexing challenge that we struggled with throughout the process was the risk averseness of really pressured civil servants who felt compelled to manage the public and political perceptions of controversial issues around climate and energy. The upshot of this was, 1, an almost complete absence of traditional and social media before, during, and after our panel, and secondly, our plan to involve community organizations as resources to support participants after the process, to build community projects and to do outreach. That simply did not happen. One implication of this weak link to civil society was the difficulty of sustaining the participants' involvement once they had submitted their report. Had we been able to better weave organizations, civic organizations, into the panel's work, we might have seen real gains in terms of connecting panelists with organizations that have expertise and mobilizing capacity. Deepening these connections might have increased the profile, influence, and our capacity. Our desire, though, as well, to communicate with broader publics was shaped by research that said that the public opinion and trust will grow if they can have access to what real deliberation looks like. And we also were persuaded by the fact that, or the thought that the more publicity would actually, the more visible it was, the more likelihood that politicians, decision makers, would feel compelled or would feel beholden to actually pay attention seriously to the recommendations. Our city partners were concerned about media exposure being seen as pressuring the council and as well as mobilizing opposing forces. So my concluding question is really just how can we create conditions and structures and align practices and incentives to connect deliberation with civil society in impactful ways? Over to you, Lorelei.
Hi, I'm Lorelei Hansen. As David mentioned, we aspire to be a catalyst for effective societal action on climate change. And one of the challenges we faced overall was finding a group that wanted to invest a lot of time, energy, and money in a citizen deliberation on climate change. As David mentioned, this was a tricky undertaking in Alberta, where there are many who still do not believe in climate change, and if they do, they don't necessarily believe that it's human-caused. As a result, we often had to treat climate change as the backseat issue rather than the sole and primary focus of our discussions. We were also challenged in the sense of needing to convince others of the merit of a public deliberation about an issue that they view as a complex scientific and technical matter that most members of the public cannot understand. This became particularly pronounced in our deliberation with the City of Edmonton around the amount of time in the deliberation that would be devoted to citizens discussing values. The city saw a discussion of values as taking away from educating the citizens on the complex details of reducing greenhouse gases and energy demands in the municipality. For the city, education of the citizens on the city's energy and climate challenges was key, so to as ensure that all the citizens were on the same page and they understood the set of choices that were available to the city. As well, the city wanted citizen recommendations that would align with or support the work that they had already undertaken. The city also viewed our existing representative democracy as the legitimate forum for making public policy decisions, and so they didn't see the deliberation results as necessarily about informing elected officials on the possible options available. Rather, the citizen deliberations would be an indication of, first, where most public education was needed, and second, the appetite amongst the public for a progressive plan for reducing greenhouse gases and energy use. In this context, it was particularly hard to see how citizen deliberations could be a catalyst for the deep, rapid, and systemic change we need to address climate change.
Hi, my name is Gwendolyn Blue. I organized a citizen panel called Water in a Changing Climate. And the purpose, the aspiration was to open the discussions both within Alberta Climate Dialogues as well as outside of Alberta Climate Dialogues to alternative frames of climate change. This coming from a recognition in the literature that climate change is many and not one. We wanted to address issues of adaptation in addition to issues of mitigation under the claim that if mitigation is about carbon, then adaptation is about water. We also aspired to enroll a diversity of voices and perspectives, including rural and First Nations voices. We faced many challenges. With the panel itself, it was a short time frame, and it was very hard to get people to connect water to climate change. They had many issues and concerns about water, and it was very difficult to connect that to bigger long-term issues around climate change. Outside of the panel, it's very hard to challenge dominant frames of climate change, and it's very difficult to get, I think, a range of people to think outside of that dominant frame of mitigation and carbon. So we continue to grapple and talk about issues of framing and power. We have realized that frames as well as processes are not neutral, and I think that is a growing recognition that some frames and some processes can reinforce rather than challenge existing systems. I think that frames also have implications for the publics that we convene, and I want to draw on the work of John Dewey, who said that issues spark publics into being, and I think climate change sparks interesting types of publics into being. Some publics have members who can speak on their own behalf, but many are represented and cannot actually enter into the dialogue, and I want to leave with a reflection on that. How do we represent those non-humans who perhaps don't have a voice, but as well as future generations who cannot be present in our deliberations, but definitely whose lives are impacted by our behaviors today.
Thank you. Well, one of my personal aspirations has always been to be on a TV game show, and somehow this feels like that. But my real aspiration for ABCD's work was to build more capacity and momentum for dialogue and deliberation to really affect policy change and citizen action on climate change. And we needed to recognize to do that, it would really take good facilitation and organizational capacity for deliberation. We find that deliberation in particular for policy input really requires rigor, and that means that it needs high quality design and facilitation. And that usually means professional level facilitation, and that increases costs. Governments can build their own internal capacity, but we find that there's a vulnerability to that. In Canada, at least at the federal level over the last 5 years, a significant capacity that was developed for public engagement has been gutted, and they no longer really have that capacity, particularly for deliberation. In terms of civil society, we know that many of them have funding and staffing pressures, but also the issue of climate change doesn't necessarily connect directly to their mission. And I think for both not-for-profits and for government, there's still a lack of real interest and commitment to engage citizens. And so the tendency in deliberation work is still for one-offs rather than consistent dialogue and deliberation processes. So the way we tried to deal with those challenges was for all 3 deliberations, we took a disciplined approach to facilitator training, so that more of that capacity for facilitation at least would be existing in the province by the time ABCD wrapped up. And we needed to recognize in doing that there was a real range of abilities and aptitudes for facilitations, especially around tough issues. We worked with a partner in the project called the Center for Public Involvement that provided a focal point for the volunteers and the non-volunteer facilitators that we were able to train. And we did succeed in building some internal capacity in some environmental groups who have an interest in climate change, coming at it perhaps through a different lens. But I think the challenge and the question still remains for us about how do we really move beyond one-off deliberations and micro-publics to build ongoing and impactful momentum on tough systemic issues.
So, I should have said before, I'm David Kahane. I lead Alberta Climate Dialogue. This gives you a bit of the flavor of some of the aspirations we had going in, some of the real frustrations and challenges we faced in doing this work, and in reflecting at this point in the project, we're really thinking of a broader community who we believe, like us, comes to this work out of values, out of political commitment, and out of a desire for some really quite profound forms of social change. And yet, like most D&D projects, if I could venture to say, we left a very faint scratch on the machine that is moving our society toward a quite frightening future when it comes to climate change, but we could talk about that in connection with many other big systemic issues as well. So when we step back, we find ourselves reflecting on the intransigence of these systems of governance and culture and economy. And we've been asking ourselves questions about how public deliberation needs to combine with other forces to leverage real systemic change. Otherwise, we in every other D&D project risks fiddling as Rome burns at best, or as putting a nice, happy, participatory face on a fundamentally dangerous or pathological set of systems. And so when I think about the biggest challenge facing the field, it's not how to get more people doing D&D, it's not how to get more young people leading D&D, it's not getting more governments and organizations using D&D. We need to reflect rigorously on how these inspiring micro-exercises, and we were inspired by being with the citizens, supporting the citizens through these processes. They were deeply changed by it. We need to think about how these micro-exercises really might add up to serious change at the macro level, and we need to strategize relentlessly about this. And so, I think that our challenge, the we in this room, the we in NCDD, is to grapple together with understandings of social stasis and change, and to develop analyses of how D&D can be one part of a coherent story of how to leverage change in complex systems. This is the work that many of us in ABCD are trying to do now as we reflect on 5 years of fulfilling but also difficult and often frustrating work. And it's not that we don't see at some level and believe at some level that more deliberation will be helpful. It's that we've seen that deliberation by itself is not nearly enough when big systems have strong tendencies that stack the deck against change, and when a merciless climate clock keeps on ticking down. So we feel pressed to come up with a clear, self-critical story about where deliberation fits with other political forces and what it takes to leverage change, given that the status quo reflects not just misunderstandings, not just an absence of citizen voice, but strong structural tendencies of our economies, societies, and cultures. And so we want this field as a whole, at meetings like this one, to design and participate in an ongoing critical conversation. This conversation needs to be about the kinds of changes our world needs, and we're going to differ on this. And it may sit in tension with our commitment to certain kinds of impartiality when we're in the room as practitioners. The conversation is going to have to be about the forces that hold an unjust and destructive status quo in place, forces that many of us believe won't be overcome simply by more dialogue and deliberation. And the conversation needs to be about how our work in dialogue and deliberation can combine with other parts of a democratic ecosystem in order to bring about real change. If we really are capable as a field, and we pride ourselves on this, if we're really capable of holding tough conversations that lead to greater wisdom, I think this conversation about dialogue, deliberation, and systems change is the one that we most need to hold for ourselves. It's one that we're holding in ABCD. We hope that the conversation you're about to have will be one more contribution to this big conversation. Because NCD, as we perceive it, is made up of researchers and practitioners who are in this for value-driven and political reasons, if we're honest about what has us doing this work and pouring our lifeblood into it. And so we owe it to ourselves. I was never going to take just 2 minutes. But I'm almost done. We owe it to ourselves and to the world to build critical stories about how dialogue and deliberation can be part of the systemic changes that we yearn for. So thank you very much.